Christmas is a big holiday in America and South Africa. Santa Claus, or Father Christmas, figures heavily in the celebrations. We believed that Jesus was the reason for the season, but also wanted our children to enjoy the fun with community children, most of which involved anticipating gifts Father Christmas would bring on Christmas Eve. So, we taught our children Father Christmas was a make-believe story that people connected to the celebration of Christ's birth. Of course, most of their friends believed Father Christmas, aka Santa Claus, was real. We taught our kids that even though that wasn't true, they were not to correct other children that believed it was. Needless to say, that led to some awkward situations. We approached Santa Claus like that because we were committed to telling our children the truth. We might not tell them all the truth, like when they asked where babies came from, but as limited as the answer might be, it would be true and not deceptive. In some respects, the four Gospels are like that. Everything in them is true, but not all the truth is in any of them. As John neared the end of his Gospel, he may have felt like people would wonder why his picture of Jesus was so different from the picture painted by the synoptics. Perhaps this is why he felt the need to add this little caveat at the end of his gospel. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. John 21:25, the very last verse of the Gospel of John. The short ministry of Jesus left the world with so much material it could be investigated from many different angles and never lead to an account that was fictional. For instance, all of the synoptic writers focused their attention on the different aspects of the promised kingdom, the Old Testament kingdom of God. John only mentions it 3 times, never once mentioning the gospel of the kingdom or the declaration that the kingdom of God was near. Now, these differences may be in part due to the 30-year gap between the writing of the synoptics and the writing of John's gospel. Out of all the things that Jesus did, the things that could fill the earth with books, John reaches back to events and teachings that were particularly important to the church of his day, a church standing on the threshold of an era with no apostles. If Matthew is the bridge to the Old Testament, then John is the bridge to the church age. One of the things that stands out in John's gospel is his use of the glory of God. Now, word studies can be misleading when used in biblical studies, but in this case, I think they point to a central tenet in John's portrayal of Jesus. Matthew uses the noun glory and the verb glorify 7 times. Mark 4 times, and Luke 19 times. John, on the other hand, uses them 31 times. Now, that on its own wouldn't be potentially that important, but when you consider how they're used, you see that there is a very different approach to the glory of God in John. All of Matthew and Mark's uses of the noun refer to the visible glory that will be seen at the second coming of Christ or when Christ is seated in his glory in heaven. Luke uses the noun with that eschatological sense, but he also uses it as praise to God in the birth narratives, similarly in the triumphal entry, and he uses it to describe Moses, Elijah, and Jesus at the transfiguration. Only one time does he use it as John does, in reference to the man Jesus entering into or experiencing glory. As for the verb, all 3 of the synoptics use it overwhelmingly to describe people's praise for God when someone is healed. John is quite different. He uses both the noun and the verb to describe Jesus' relationship to the Father. Mahoney describes it like this: glorifying and being glorified are mutual in the relationship between the Father and the Son. This isn't really surprising since John spends so much time describing the relationship between the Father and the Son, both eternally, but most importantly and most often in terms of his incarnate state. John's prologue in chapter 1, verses 1 to 18, introduces us to the glory of God right at the start. It begins with the eternal Logos in 1:1 and clearly states that the Word or Logos was God and the light of mankind. Then John explains John the Baptist's role in relation to the light. In one way, chapter 1, 16 to 13 serves as an abstract of the entire Gospel of John. After reading it, we know what the story is about. He came to his own. And we know how the story will end. His own did not receive him, chapter 1, verse 11. Verse 14 tells the reader how the eternal Word came to his own people. The Word became flesh. So there in the first verses, we have the heart of Christianity. Jesus Christ is God and man. This is a critical insight for John the storyteller. He wants his readers to know right up front that Jesus is God. The Word was God, chapter 1, verse 1. Early in the story, it will become clear that along with the reader, Jesus knows he is God. So both the reader and Jesus know he is God, but no one else in the story is privy to that information. And this creates the tension one feels as they read through the gospel. It's a tension created by the fact that the Word became flesh. The people in the story see only a man. They express this perspective in John 6:42 when they say, "Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he now say, 'I have come down from heaven'?" It's incredulous to them that this man would make some of the claims he makes. The idea that the eternal Word became flesh casts its shadow over the entire gospel. In verse 14, it's linked to John's understanding of the glory of God. The Word became flesh, dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the unique Son of God, full of grace and truth. John says he saw the glory. Now, of course, he wasn't looking at the eternal Word. He was looking at a human being. That statement is really critical. We saw his glory. They saw it when they looked at a man. So this is the glory of God in flesh. Later in chapter 17 and verse 5, Jesus will ask the Father to once again give to him the glory that he had with him from the creation of the world. But that prayer makes it clear that that was not the glory that John saw. It is a mistake to look for outcroppings of deity in this man, Jesus Christ. John doesn't put them there. John saw the glory of God in a man. John goes on to tell us what that glory was. It was grace and truth. Two of the communicable attributes of God, that is, attributes, divine attributes human beings can possess. This glory was manifest in three ways in John. The first of these ways in which he manifests his glory as a man, as someone who is the eternal Word in flesh, is through his signs. In John 2:11, it says after he turns the water into wine, that this was his first sign, and by it he declared or manifested his glory. It's very interesting that in John, the word miracle never appears. It does appear in the synoptics with regard to Jesus's miracles, but John never uses the word miracle. He only uses the word sign, and he uses it for Jesus's miraculous activity and some of the other things that he did that were signs of his messiahship. Unfortunately, some people think, oh, this is an evidence of his divine nature. But of course it is not. These signs are just the same thing as what we saw in the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels. They are the realization of Old Testament prophecies that proved he was who he said that he was. He had the power to create the conditions of the kingdom. And John uses the word that is really the best word, a sign. Think of it this way. If you're traveling through Mauritania, and there are signs all over the place in French, but you don't speak French, those signs are meaningless to you. And that's exactly what the signs of Jesus were. They were signposts pointing in a certain direction, so many miles to the capital. But if you didn't read the language in which the sign was written, it was meaningless to you and it would not point you in the right direction. Now, what was the language in which these signs were written? The language was Old Testament prophecy. People who knew and believed the Old Testament were able to read the signs, and then they were able to follow and go in the right direction. We looked at this in one of our earlier videos with John the Baptist in Luke 7. So John's word sign is a great word because it is speaking of the impact or the reason Jesus was doing miracles. They pointed in the right direction. This is the Messiah. And they demonstrated his glory, that he was doing those things which God said Messiah would be able to do. Unfortunately, in John, the miracles were not understood by those without faith. And so in John 6, verses 26 to 30, he says, you're following not because you saw the sign. I love that. Not because you saw the sign, read it, and therefore you're following me. Rather, you're following me for a free lunch. And this is what is so ironic, that they recognize the miraculous nature, that something really unique had happened, but they didn't understand the sign significance of what had happened. And so in chapter 12, verse 37, though he did many signs, it says they did not believe. And that's because their hearts were hard. They didn't understand the scriptures and they couldn't read the signs. But these signs were a manifestation of his glory, that he was the one sent from the Father. That was his glory, and we're going to see that. His glory was that he was the one appointed by the Father and sent by the Father and doing the will of the Father. Another aspect of his glory is grace and truth, what we might think of as character. In every way, Jesus fully, perfectly demonstrated all of the communicable attributes of God. And it's so important to remember that when we talk about the glory of God, all we're talking about is the brilliance and the beauty of who he is. The Old Testament uses visible light to express that as a metaphor of his glory. But when Moses asked to see God's glory, what did God do? He marched before him and he declared his attributes. The glory of God is the sum of his attributes in sort of this critical mass that makes him beautiful and wonderful and glorious. And so we can share the glory of God to the degree that we express and are controlled by and are defined by, that's a better word, the communicable attributes of God. But if we're not, then we're not showing the glory of God. Here was Jesus, full, it says, of grace and truth, a man totally characterized by the communicable attributes of God. So in chapter 8 and verse 46, he can say, which of you can charge me of a crime? Who can point out anything that I have ever done that was wrong? And finally, the third way in which he manifests his glory was in his relationship to the Father. In John 8:50 is an example of it. I am not seeking my own glory. I am doing this for the glory of my Father. So the very nature of our calling as image bearers is that we don't seek our glory, but we seek to reflect the glory of God. And Jesus said constantly, that's what I'm doing. What I'm doing, I do by the power of God and for the glory of my Father. It's important to underscore that from John's perspective, none of these things, his signs, his character, his relationship with the Father, were unique to his humanity. Jesus was simply living as a perfect man. His divine glory was in some way veiled from sight. We see that is true in John 17:5. And he has given up the use of his divine attributes in some miraculous way that is hinted at in Philippians chapter 2. And so we conclude that Jesus is not a superman. He's living in dependence upon the Father and in the power of the Spirit. Now, all of this created the tension that I mentioned earlier. And this is how I would picture that tension. First of all, it has to do with what people saw when they looked at Jesus. They saw his humanity. John's understanding of the incarnation comes through with great clarity. He constantly paints the picture of Jesus as a perfect man, not a superman, nor a man with divine powers, but a man empowered and directed by the Father and the Spirit in ways available to any person. Throughout his incarnate life, Jesus depended on the Father and was a perfect image bearer. And so he gave testimony to this. He says his works were dependent upon the Father. John chapter 5, verse 18. He says he came to do the will of the Father, not his own will. That's what human beings are supposed to do. Now, he was God, and as God, it was his will as much as it was the Father's will. But as a man, the proper position for a man was, I have come, it is written in the volume of the book, to do thy will, O God. He taught only what he learned from the Father. People think, well, how did Jesus know all this? Is this a sign of his omniscience? And the answer to that, I would say, is no. He himself says, I'm only teaching what I've learned of my Father. He was dependent upon the Father for that knowledge. He sought to glorify the Father, not himself. We already talked about that. And even his understanding of his own pre-existence and deity, he learned from the Father, John 8, 25 and 26. So in every way, Jesus lived as a man and demonstrates for us how to live as a perfect image bearer. So when people looked at him, what they saw was a man. But here's where the problem comes in. What did people hear when they listened to Jesus? What people heard when Jesus spoke were concepts which would have been deemed lunacy, and often they were by those who were blind to the perfection of his humanity. They would have been deemed lunacy if it were not for his perfect and glorious life. He could not be true to his identity without affirming certain things. A unique relationship to the Father. I and the Father are one, John 10:30. The fact that he was the Messiah. He directly told the woman in Samaria, I am the one who is speaking to you, I am he. He affirmed an eternal pre-existence with the Father. Before Abraham, I was, John 5, 16 through 18 and 8:58. And he affirmed that all of the powers and privileges of God, though he refused to use them, were his by right. Here, Jesus is a mere man making all of these claims to be God, and that created a problem for those who did not pay attention to the things that indicated this wasn't lunacy, such as his perfect life, the testimony of Moses, and the signs that he performed that were predicted in the Old Testament. What were people expected to put together? Jesus knew who he was, and he openly claimed for himself things that were not self-evident to others, like, I and the Father are one. However, many people connected these dots. We see illustrations of that, where people came to understand who exactly Jesus was. So how were they supposed to connect the dots? Well, they had the testimony of the Father, the voice of God speaking, which Jesus says in 12:28 was for the sake of those who were there. They have the witness of John the Baptist as someone who fulfilled the scriptures. They have the Old Testament scriptures themselves. And then they had the works that he performed. His works testified to the legitimacy of what he was saying about himself. Now, when people couldn't connect the dots, that was a result of the scriptures tell us of God's judgment upon the nation. John 12, where Jesus quotes from Isaiah and says that God was hardening the hearts of the people because of their unbelief. And then it's also because they are not those chosen by God. Jesus said, no one comes to me except the Father draws me. He said, all that are given to me by my Father will come to me. And then in John 6, when people are discouraged and turning away, he said, I told you, you couldn't come unless the Father had given you to me. The tension in John's story has profound theological roots. It grows out of his ability to portray Jesus as true God and true man. In John's gospel, Jesus lives within the limitations of his humanity, never doing anything that reveals his deity, and refusing to give the type of sign that would prove he is God. But at the same time, he boldly and publicly claims to be God and expects people to believe that claim based on the scriptures and his perfect life and his signs. Now, this creates a lot of tension for the reader as they read through the story, and it becomes a great platform for teaching a profound and deep Christology. It's no wonder that this gospel played such a significant role in the early church's Christological debates and the formation of some of the early creeds that defined that Jesus was true God and true man. John presents Christ's death as his glorification. This is a different, though not contradictory, perspective from that of the Synoptic Gospels. They focus on the glorification that came through the resurrection, ascension, and second coming. John acknowledges this aspect of Christ's glorification in 17:5 and 7:39, but his emphasis is on the glorification of the Son of Man on the cross. This makes sense given his focus on the humanity of Jesus. A human being is most glorious when he or she lives in submission to the will of the Father, even when that leads to a cross. Early in the gospel, Jesus hinted that his exaltation would be connected to his death. He does that with the phrase lifted up. In 3:14, he says that he will be lifted up as was Moses' serpent, an obvious reference to his death on the cross. In 8:28, he again uses the phrase lifted up of his death when he says, "When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am." But the line of thought comes to a great climax in 12:20-50. That passage marks the transition from Christ's ministry to his passion. The passage begins with a curious account of the Greek seeking Jesus. Now, we're never told whether or not Jesus entertains these Greek visitors, but the request leads Jesus to think of the hour of his death and the identification of that death with his glorification. In 12:23, Jesus says, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." That the hour relates to his death is clear in the illustration of the seed that dies, which follows immediately, and in the prayer that comes in 12:27. Interestingly, though John has at other times emphasized the vicarious nature of Christ's death in passages like John 6:51, 10:11, 11:50, and 15:13, here he emphasizes the exemplary nature of his death. His death is an example to humanity. What he is about to do, his disciples must do. "If anyone serves me," he says, "he must follow me." And it's clear in the illustration, he must follow me in falling to the earth and dying. All this underscores the thought that Jesus' death is the highest level of glory available to a human being. In 12:27, Jesus prays, "Now my soul has become troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Here's a man in submission to and dependence upon the Father. He does not ask God to deliver him from the hour, since he understands this is God's will for him. His only request is that the Father would glorify his name in that hour. Jesus then identifies two things that will happen at his death. First, the rule of this world will be cast out, he says. He will be cast off his throne. Jesus understands that his death will earn him the right to rule the planet for the glory of God. This thought is captured in Hebrews 2:9, which says Jesus was crowned with glory and honor because, key word, because of the suffering of death. Second, he will be lifted up and as a result draw all kinds of people to himself. John explains in 12:33 that the lifting up relates to his crucifixion. In 12:39-41, John refers to Isaiah 6 to explain the blindness of the people of Israel as a judgment of God. 12:41 says, "These things Isaiah said because he saw his, Jesus' glory, and he spoke of him." Isaiah 6 was a pre-incarnate vision of the glorified Son of God. Given John's repeated use of the phrase "lifted up," it surely was not lost on him that Isaiah 6 begins with this statement: "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up." There's a subtle irony here. In Isaiah 6, we see the glory Christ had with the Father in eternity. But now, in this hour, we're going to see the glory Christ will experience as a man, his crucifixion. On that cross, he will put on display his glory. It would have been just as appropriate for the angels of God to gather at the foot of the cross as they gathered around Isaiah's throne and sing, "Holy, holy, holy," for this is a majestic display of glory in a man. 2 more times prior to his death, Jesus identified the cross with his glorification. In 13:32, when Judas goes out to betray him, he says, "Now the Son of Man is glorified." Then in 17:1, he once again prays to the Father with these words, "Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you." At the cross, Jesus demonstrates what it means for a human to manifest the glory of God. For human beings, glory is not expressed through brilliant light or unprecedented power. It is expressed through virtue. And the highest virtue a person can possess is the willingness to sacrifice his or her life for the sake of others in obedience to the will of the Father. That Jesus would die for us is remarkable. That he would die in obedience to his Father is glorious. Thank you.